This is Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. Thank you for joining me. We are studying the book of Isaiah this quarter, and the quarterly is written by Dr. Roy Gain. Dr. Gain is a professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern languages at the Theological Seminary at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, and he joins me now. Dr. Gain, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Welcome to Sabbath School.
Thank you very much, Pastor Bradshaw. It's good to be with you.
These are just great lessons. Isaiah is a phenomenal book. You have mentioned already, you had the privilege of studying Isaiah in Hebrew, modern Hebrew at least, in Jerusalem. It must have been a very rich experience looking at this. And here we get to really a beautiful part of the book of Isaiah. It's magnificent. Isaiah is one of these books, it's like my home country of New Zealand. We've kind of got it all. We've got glaciers and beautiful golden beaches and mountains and plains and fjords and rolling farm country. Isaiah is the New Zealand of the Bible, I'm going to say, because there's history and there's prophecy and there's poetry. I knew you'd enjoy that. And there's high drama and there's this beautiful... I'm going to read this verse here because today we're going to get to... not just staying, but we'll get to Isaiah chapter 53. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. That's Isaiah 53:5. The memory verse, the opening story, is about a Chinese Christian who, in order to reach Chinese slaves in South America as a free man, sold himself into slavery. And as a result of so doing, 200 people were liberated by accepting Jesus as their Lord and Savior. It's a beautiful story, and it really does hint very strongly at the ministry of Jesus. Sunday, Isaiah's testing truth. You point us to Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 10. But I'm fascinated that you refer to this as Isaiah's testing truth. Why did you call this Isaiah's testing truth, and why are we to look at it like that?
It's a testing truth in the sense that it's pointing forward to a deliverer who would be not only vulnerable, but he would suffer the worst degradation. And this really is a truth that is difficult to swallow unless you have total faith in God and his plan of salvation. We have to believe in the one who makes himself ultimately humble. He's humiliated. In the ancient Near East, a religion was viewed as being a good religion that you wanted to follow if it was one that the people were prosperous, they were wealthy, and they were at peace, and they were victorious in their battles. If you had someone who was persecuted, downtrodden, and so on and so forth, their God must not be a very powerful God. Jesus Christ turns everything on its head because for the Jews, he was the testing truth. And the way it worked was, rather than being outwardly victorious, he was despised, he was rejected, he was almost without human form in how bad he looked when he was on the cross. He didn't even hardly look like a human being. And yet, by going to the uttermost depths of degradation and humiliation, he was able to turn everything on its head. He was able to turn apparent defeat into total victory. And that's why the Romans were unable to stamp out Christianity in the empire. They were operating on the old paradigm. And that is, if you persecute people, you make them downtrodden and you hurt them, then that's a bad sign for their religion. It turned out to be the opposite because of Jesus' sacrifice.
Yeah, it's really interesting here. You point out about the idea of honor. We remember that fascinating story where David's envoys were seized and half their beard was shaved off and their garments were cut in a way that exposed them rather embarrassingly. In Isaiah chapter 50, we're talking about this servant, and it's talking about him having hair plucked out of his beard, he's spat on, and so forth. I'm reading from the quarterly. But with all this power and honor, for some unthinkable reason, he does not save himself. This is so strange that people don't believe it. It points forward to the cross where they say, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, the chosen one. This had to really be perplexing, didn't it? For people who were looking for a mighty deliverer. The idea that the deliverer was a lamb. It's so important for us to try to bridge over into that culture so we can really understand some passages that would have been understood or viewed from a completely different perspective from our own. Talk to me about that. The shock, maybe the unbelievability of reading these passages, and you'd be saying, who is this weakling? Yet he was the Messiah.
That's right. This was an honor-shame society, as Middle Eastern cultures are today. In an honor-shame society, honor is the most important thing. It's more important than life. And if you go against my family's honor, I will kill you. That's the way that works in an honor-shame society. In fact, there was a case that I heard about, I think it was in Lebanon, where there was a man in modern times who was an older man. Well, he was just a mature man, I guess. And he refused to run to get out of the way of an oncoming vehicle, and he was killed because it would be dishonorable for a mature man to run. So he didn't run, and he got killed. I mean, that's how important honor is. And I could give you other examples of that. So the idea of a shamed deliverer is a total oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. It's just not going to happen. But really, when you think about it, all of this message goes back, and it has its DNA in Genesis 3:15, where God curses the serpent. And he says that Genesis 3:15, maybe we should just look at that briefly. He says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So Isaiah is unpacking, what does it mean, the bruising of the heel of the seed who is to come, the offspring who is to come, which is Jesus Christ, the ultimate deliverer. Now, we have you referred to Isaiah chapter 50. This is the third of 4 servant poems. The first of those servant poems is in Isaiah 42, which is referring to the servant being a leader of justice. He is going to be so gentle, in fact, he won't cry aloud or lift up his voice. Isaiah 42, verse 2. A bruised reed he will not break. A faintly burning wick he will not quench. He's going to be gentle. And of course, Jesus was gentle. And you can think there are a lot of people who are like these faintly burning wicks that could be quenched. There are a lot of people who just one little word of discouragement is going to put them over the edge. You know, Jesus didn't do that. He was encouraging people, brings forth justice, and so on. But then as we go into the second servant poem in chapter 49, we find that not everything goes his way. 49 verse 4, I have labored in vain. I've spent my strength for nothing in vanity. My right is with the Lord, and so on. And so Jesus has frustration in his ministry. And it would appear that nothing is happening. In fact, in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, it says that the Messiah would be cut off and have nothing. Okay? And Jesus had nothing, literally, on the cross. He had nothing. He didn't even have his clothes. He was naked on the cross, and the soldiers were dividing his garments among them. He had nothing. But then when we get into chapter 50, to the servant poem that you were citing, we find that not only is he frustrated and vulnerable, yet he is being attacked. He's going through something that is really dishonorable and physically. Look, if you were in a Middle Eastern society and you slap someone's face today, you will go home in a body bag. I was at Nineveh, and there was one of our team was from England, and he got angry with one of the workers, and he slapped him. Well, if it hadn't been for another teammate who was from Lebanon, an older man, a very experienced man who knew Arabic fluently, our English friend would have gone home in a body bag. You don't do that. Here, he is not only having this done to him, he is voluntarily allowing them. I gave my back to those who struck. It's voluntary. He's going through it. And then in the fourth servant poem, we're going to get to the ultimate. We're going to get to the ultimate of what happens. He doesn't just go through it. He's not just vulnerable. He's not just doing it voluntarily. In the fourth servant poem, he's going to do it for us in our place as our substitute.
Very powerful. I'm really taken by something that you've written on Monday's lesson. This is not the milk of Isaiah's word. He has prepared his audience by developing the messianic theme from the early part of his book. In following the overall course of the Messiah's life on earth, the prophet started with his conception and birth, introduced his identity as a divine Davidic king, elaborated on his work of restoration for Israel, and quiet ministry of liberation from injustice and suffering. That's Isaiah 42. The other chapters are mentioned here. Then Isaiah revealed that the Messiah's grand drama includes the contrast of tragedy before exaltation. Now the suffering servant poem, as it's referred to in the lesson, plumbs the depths of the tragedy. You know what I think is going to be best here? I'm going to ask you to take 2 minutes now, just a little over, because that's all we've got before the break. Let's look in Isaiah 53, or in fact it starts at the end of chapter 52, and let's walk through this, and you draw from this what you believe are the most salient points, those things that we really ought to look at in the context of the lesson. Go ahead. Take 2 minutes for now.
Very briefly, the overall trajectory of this fourth servant poem is like the Grand Canyon. It starts up high. In 52:13, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, shall be exalted. And then it goes down, and we find that he is vulnerable, growing up like a young plant. And then he has no beauty that we should desire him, a man of sorrows. He goes down, down, down into the depths. And then he goes into death and then the tomb for us. But then at the end, he's exalted. He goes up the other side. So it's like going down into the Grand Canyon and then up the other side. It's really the trajectory of Philippians 2, verses 5 and following. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. In other words, follow his example. And 1 Peter 2 talks about following his example. And it says there, verse 6 of Philippians, who though he was in the form of God, didn't count equality with God like a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself. And then by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Down, 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 down to the ultimate. And then the next verse, therefore God has highly exalted him, bestowed on him the name that is above every name. That is the trajectory of this fourth servant poem. Down and then honor and glory and victory on the other side, which is what we see at the end of Psalm 22. You know, Psalm 22 is what Jesus cited on the cross. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. He says it in an Aramaic translation that everyone would understand. Why, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then all this bad stuff going on, but it ends up in a shout of triumph and praise. What has God done? He was able to see through the portals of the tomb because he was walking by faith in God's word alone, not by sight.
It is a majestic book, and there are so many high points, so many memorable passages of this book, and I think there's no higher point than the low point, which is Isaiah chapter 53, where Jesus died for us. I do want to recommend this to you because I do believe it'll be a blessing to your study. The book of Isaiah, the companion book to the Sabbath School Quarterly, written by Dr. Gain, Thoughts as High as Heaven. You can get this from itiswritten.shop and other places as well. Itiswritten.shop is open 24/6. And if you get the companion book, you're going to go further and deeper and higher and broader in your study and appreciation and your experience in the book of Isaiah. We will be back with more Sabbath School in just a moment. This is Sabbath School brought to you by It Is Written.
I just want to say thank you. I watched a minute devotional TV segment you did, and it converted me. I was in a dark place, and you helped me find God, and then God helped me.
I've been around for a long time, and I know a good thing when I see it. Your inspirational programs are wonderful. May God bless you bountifully.
After losing my husband in a car accident back in 2015, I started to listen to It Is Written. This ministry was one of the many ways God chose to speak and bring me closer to Him. May the Lord continue to bless this ministry.
Welcome back to Sabbath School on It Is Written, lesson 10 of this quarter's quarterly, Isaiah. It is doing the unthinkable. We're focusing right now on Isaiah chapter 53, where Jesus did the unthinkable. Tuesday, you've titled, Dr. Gain, Who Has Believed? And there's a lot to look at, but I do want to zoom in on this. I'm fascinated by it. Isaiah 53, verse 1, it says, look at the questions. Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? It's interesting, these questions emphasize the challenge of believing the unbelievable, compare with John chapter 12, and warn us to sit down for the rest of the story. Take it from there.
Yeah, well, this is an appeal, really, isn't it? Who has believed? It's a question. Are we going to believe? We're the later audience of what's going on. To whom is the arm of the Lord being revealed? Are we going to accept His power and the way He works out for us? Now, it's interesting that here the chapter 53, verse 2, refers to Jesus' childhood. He grew up before Him. That is, this servant grew up before the Lord like a young plant. So he's vulnerable. No form of majesty that we should look at him. No beauty that we should desire him. He didn't come looking like a king, clothed with all this kind of amazing garments and living in a palace that people should think he's something special. He was just ordinary. He was another citizen of the city of Nazareth there in Galilee. But then it goes into his being despised, rejected, as one from whom men hide their faces. This is all about shame. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. But I love what Paul says about how Christ was despising the shame. There's the answer to an honor-shame culture. Despising the shame itself. That's amazing what Paul says. But then the shock comes in verse 4. The shock is in verse 4. Up until now, okay, we can see this is someone who's despised. But then in verse 4, bam, surely he has borne whose griefs? Our sorrows. And it repeats, our. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. With his wounds, we are healed. And so then we realize, wait a minute, this is us. This is us. You know, there's a saying, we have met the enemy and he is us. Well, here we've met the friend and he is us.
Yeah, it's fascinating here too when you look at verse 6, and I don't want to cut you off if you had more to say on that, but Isaiah really turns this thing. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. So we've done wrong. We've committed sin. We've turned our backs on God. But it's fascinating. Isaiah writes, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It's profound and it's moving and it's miles deep, isn't it?
It is. And really, I regard this as the inner sanctum. This is the Holy of Holies of Isaiah. Just like Leviticus 16 on the Day of Atonement is the inner sanctum of the Pentateuch. This is amazing. Years ago, I preached a sermon comparing David when he was fleeing from Absalom because of the sins that he had committed with Bathsheba and these. And as a result, he was going out a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But then I turned it to this passage and Jesus, really. 1,000 years later, there came another one who was acquainted with sorrows and grief, but it was not for his own sins. And then I just started quoting, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And you know what happened? At that point, everybody in the audience just started crying. Just repeating those words. When you realize, when it really sinks in, what he has done for us. He has been our substitute. In my place, he suffered that shame, degradation, and all of that. It just is so powerful. We like sheep, and the Lord has laid on him. The word in Hebrew for iniquity is the word avon, which can mean, and I believe it means that here, culpability. That is the blame, the punishability, those who get the rap for what someone has done. And then he was oppressed and afflicted, opened not his mouth, like a lamb that's led to the slaughter. My wife was a missionary's daughter in the country of Nepal. She has witnessed Hindu sacrifices. and the sheep do not make a sound when they're taken to have their throat slit or whatever. The goats do. The goats scream and everything, but sheep don't. And he was just silent. Then he's cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, with a rich man in his death. Now, interestingly, I was in a class at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem where our teacher, who was a rabbi, was discussing this passage right here. And I was, I think, the only Christian in the class. The rest of the class were Israeli Jews. And when the teacher got to this point, he pointed out that whereas the traditional Jewish interpretation is that this suffering servant is the nation, the Jewish nation, he said this cannot be the nation. This here is speaking about an individual. Now, he didn't know if that was Jeremiah or some other righteous person, some prophet. He wasn't going to say who we think it is, obviously, as Christians, but it really needs to be an individual. Although he had done no violence, there's no deceit in his mouth. So he's suffering for us, even though he was innocent. That's the point. And he's like the animal sacrifices. Those animals were innocent, and yet they were sacrificed on behalf of people. He's the one fulfilling that. And then in verse 10, it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He is put into grief. In other words, it was God's decision. And he allows it. The suffering servant allows it. This was the Trinity agreeing to what they were going to do. Now, we have in the story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, we have the story from the point of view of the Father and the suffering of the Father. We always think of the suffering of Jesus, and the suffering of this servant is pointing to Jesus. We know that because Acts chapter 8, when Philip was talking to the Ethiopian eunuch, he quotes this and refers to Jesus. And it fits the profile. And it fits in with the other servant poems, which fit with the other messianic passages earlier in Isaiah, and it's got to be the same person. But here we have the will of the Lord is to do this. This is to save us and to do that on our behalf.
I want to just jump in here, Dr. Gain, because there's a question I've got to ask you, and if you were to line up all the profound verses in the Bible, or profound statements in the Bible, you wouldn't find many that are more profound than this one in verse 11. He shall see of the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied. He went through this willingly. He looked into the future and he said, I'm okay with this because you'll be saved. Let me ask this question. It's a potentially sensitive question, but I know that everyone wants an answer to this question. You have many Jewish friends, and so I know you'll give a very respectful answer. You've studied in Jewish universities. You've lived in Israel. We look at Isaiah chapter 53 and we say, Jesus. Jews look at Isaiah 53, and I'm not 100% sure what they say. They talk about Israel as being the suffering servant. In some cases, they say, help me to understand, and I know you're going to be as respectful as anybody ever could be. How do Jews look at this passage and fail to see Jesus? I understand Christ does not feature in the culture. They are not Christians. I get that. But how do Jewish scholars work their way around this, where it seems to us to be so clear? Why isn't it clear to others? To some, this is a very obvious answer, but for many, it's a perplexing sort of a question, because we say, why doesn't everybody see this? You got 3 minutes.
As I told you, I was at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and you could have cut the air with a knife in that classroom. I've never been in such a tense classroom. And I think that the Word of God is just appealing. And the only reason is just to deny it because of all of the tragedies of history where Christians have done bad things, and they really just don't want to believe that it's Jesus Christ. Now, I point out in my companion book, and by the way, here is what we're talking about right here on the cover, but here I trace the messianic passages in Isaiah and really demonstrate from the text that really this has to be talking about the same person who is divine. He's descended from David, and the profile is got to be adding up to Jesus Christ. There's nobody else. But the reality is that some people just do not want to accept that. They want to bracket that out and say they find an alternative, which is that it is the nation. Now, but going back to, if you don't mind, back to this text here. In verse 10, it says, he shall see his offspring. This is very profound because in Daniel chapter 9:26, it says the Messiah will be cut off. And in the Pentateuch, that's a judicial penalty for someone who commits a crime. God inflicts this himself, and it means that the person will not have an afterlife in seeing in having even a line of posterity. They will lose their line of descendants. But here is someone who is going to be cut off according to same term in Daniel, although this here from being cut off from the land of the living in Isaiah 53 is a different term. But in Daniel, he's cut off. And yet here in Isaiah, he sees his offspring. How could that be? He's cut off, but yet he has an afterlife. And the reason is because he's doing it for others. He is innocent. He is the only one, Jesus is the only one who suffers the equivalent of the second death, which he must suffer for us to deliver us from that. And yet he comes forth from that. He comes forth from the death from which there is no return. And then in verse 11, it says, by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. He shall bear their iniquities. And really this expression here in Hebrew, it says, he shall justify the just for many, is what it really says here. Justify the just for many. That term, justify the just, shows up in other places like Deuteronomy 25, verse 1, 1 Kings 8:32, where it's referring to a judge who is vindicating the innocent as opposed to condemning the guilty. How is it possible here that this suffering servant is going to be able to say that these people are innocent? That is, we are innocent when we are all sheep who have gone astray. We've done all these bad things. And this is not just fiction. When a judge judges, he's supposed to judge justly. He doesn't change a person from being unjust to being just. He recognizes what the person is and declares the person to be what they are. So how could this servant then, in this passage, justify the just and thereby declare them to be righteous, that is to say, blameless and not worthy of punishment? And the only answer is, and it comes through loud and clear in this passage, it is the message, it is the testing truth of this passage. It is the substitution of Christ, and that alone makes it possible for us to be just when he justifies, because he is just when he justifies those who believe, according to Romans 3, verse 26. That's the gospel right here in Isaiah.
Powerful. Isaiah is the gospel prophet. Dr. Gain, as always, the time has just flown by far too fast. And of course, we can't possibly get to it all, but that's what the week of study is about. Thank you so much for joining me. Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Wonderful studies. Next week, Waging Love. That's lesson 11. I hope you won't miss it. It's going to be just as good as any of the studies we've had so far. I'm so blessed to be joined by Dr. Roy Gain, the author of this quarter's Sabbath School Quarterly. Let's do this again. Join me again next time for more of Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written.